Good evening and welcome. I'm Victoria Leung, Events Chair and member of the board of the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom. On behalf of the club, I welcome our members and guests to our talk with Mr. Mohsin Ismail, Principal of the Newham Collegiate Sixth Form, otherwise known as NCS. He will be interviewed by Stuart Gordon, the Harvard Club's outreach coordinator and a fellow board member. The talk is entitled, "Please, Sir, Can I Go to Harvard?" This title is actually taken from a feature in the Sunday Times magazine on NCS. This event is by no means specifically about what it takes to get into Harvard. This is about how good education, resourceful mentoring, grit, and ambition can completely change the odds for young people from underprivileged backgrounds. Within 3 years of its founding in 2014, under Mohsin's leadership, NCS managed to send 95% of their students to Russell Group universities. Now, the school consistently boasts of admissions to the Ivies, Oxbridge, and other top universities. Furthermore, this story is testimony to the importance of a club's outreach work. Led by Stuart, the Harvard Club's outreach team have visited and communicated with hundreds of state schools in the UK over the past several years. We have educated the teachers on the US college system and encouraged the students to apply, with many heartwarming success stories. Mohsin and Stuart have been working together since the founding of NCS. I'll turn it over to Stuart to start the program very soon. But before I do so, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you're not muted already, please turn on your mute button in order to minimize background noise. And if you have questions, please submit them by using the chat feature in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Mohsin will answer your questions for the last 20 minutes or so. And now, over to Stuart.
Thanks very much, Vicky, and welcome to Mohsin. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Stuart. Really looking forward to having a discussion this evening.
Yes, indeed. Mohsin, your success at getting loads of your students into university, despite working in one of the most deprived London boroughs, has attracted a lot of press interest over the last couple of years. So I'm going to start by just looking at some of the newspaper headlines that you've been getting. Starting with this one, which I think is from the Mail. City lawyer who gave up his fat salary to become Britain's most inspiring head. This from the Times. I see no reason why a poor migrant kid can't compete with an Etonian. The New York Post. Super principal gets nearly all of his inner city students into college. Lawyers A-team of inner city kids head to top unis. And city solicitor turned East End teacher set to send 95% of pupils to Russell Group unis. Now, before we get onto your work at NCS, I'd like to talk a bit about your background. I know that you were born and brought up in the East End, where you were, or East London rather, where you now work. You have an Indian father and a Moroccan mother, and they emigrated to the UK in the late 1960s. Were they particularly ambitious for you as a child?
They were extremely ambitious, Stuart. My parents came to the UK with no formal education, but what they had was that immigrant drive, which was to see their children go to some of the best universities in the country, succeed academically because they valued education and they knew the importance of it. So it was drilled in from a very young age that getting an education was paramount and it was extremely important, even though my parents themselves, through, I think, no fault of their own, just by the virtue of being born into the families that they're in, couldn't themselves get a formal education that I had the privilege of getting.
Yeah. So you eventually went to one of the local state secondary schools in East London, where you did very well academically. How were you perceived by your classmates? Did they think of you as the school swot?
I think if you're an academic student growing up in East London, disadvantaged areas in a state comprehensive in the 1990s, the last thing you wanted to be recognised as was a academic SWAT, because you'd probably get beaten up, to be honest. So you quickly learn to maneuver and manage both sides of the fence. So you could be cool with the kids you needed to, but also make sure that you got your education, didn't boast too much about it in the interim period. So it was about survival.
Okay, so you obviously negotiated that quite well, because You then went on to the London School of Economics, where you studied law, and then on to your first job in a city law firm. Now, I understand when you arrived in the law firm, you suffered from imposter syndrome. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think growing up, you compared yourself to the students around you, and as long as you were doing well compared to them, you thought that was success. And then you get good A-level results, you go to a top Russell Group university. But it was only when I went to Norton Rose and I realized that the education that my privileged peers had from an independent and grammar school was far superior than mine. And in that, I meant the opportunities that they were given and the level at which that they were expected to operate. The thing in my school was about passing exams. And when you spoke to some of my colleagues, their breadth of knowledge and understanding was so vast. And that had to come from the schooling themselves, but also their families as well, who bring that cultural, social capital that middle-class families can provide their children, which my parents couldn't. And that's where I really began to see the gulf in education between somebody who may be able and bright in a state school compared to somebody who's able and bright who goes to an independent school, who has parents who can support them along that way.
Yeah. And what motivated you to give up your job as a lawyer to become a teacher? Was it just that you had a bad time, or were there other reasons?
I quite enjoyed being in the law firm, to be honest, even though I suffered a bit of imposter syndrome. I was quite strong in character. I felt I could get over it. But it was that realization that a state school student who wanted to aspire to go to some of these elite professions, work in the city, that the state school itself didn't really give them the social cultural capital, as well as the knowledge, educational knowledge that they needed, the breadth of educational knowledge, but also some of those corporate and social codes that you are exposed to if you have families working in these industries. And for me, I felt as though, and I remember the moment, it was at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, drafting I think it was a 50 million banking and finance document, thinking, well, this has got to change, because I didn't see too many people like me, i.e. From a disadvantaged background, working class. And unless someone went back into the schools and say, look, if you want our kids to get into these professions, then something has to fundamentally change. And therefore I thought it was my duty to do that.
Okay, so you left because you had this strong motivation to want to improve state education. So you left the law firm, you went, and I think you did a 1-year postgraduate certificate in education, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you ended up in your first school, which was also in East London, where you taught economics. Tell us about your first teaching job, and what eventually made you decide to move on and apply for a principal's post.
Well, I think for me, when I left the legal profession, I was always ambitious, and my aim was to become a head teacher of a school. I didn't leave law. I left law for the sole purpose of having this model and idea about how state school education should be, and I wanted to make sure I implemented that. And so in the first couple of years at my first secondary school, I did everything and anything I could to get the experience, get the skill set. So I was ready to move on to senior leadership level, and then eventually into headship. So from starting the PGC to actually becoming a head teacher, it took me about 6 years, which is quite quick for somebody in the teaching profession. But I was resolute and ambitious to do that. And it was great to have mentors at my school who supported that ambition.
Yeah, just a matter of interest, what did your parents think about you giving up your lawyer's job and becoming a teacher? Because you had to take a phenomenal drop in salary, from what I understand.
It was a cut in salary, but for me, it was about the moral imperative. And I thought that sometimes people have to make those sacrifices in order to ensure that the future generations have the opportunities that we hope for them to have. My dad in particular was extremely proud that I'd gone to LSE and become a corporate lawyer in the city, and he would boast about it to all his friends. And when I told him that I became a teacher, I wanted to become a teacher, he didn't speak to me for a week. He thought it was I was being, it was a downgrade for him. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he got over it in the end.
All right, that's good. Okay, so how did you find out about the principal's job at NCS, and what was the selection process like?
So it was a colleague who saw the advert being placed and said to me, "Have you seen this? This looks something that you would be good at doing. You should apply." And I thought, well, it's a principal's job of a school. Sounds interesting. I'd give it a go. So I put in an application, and I was rejected the first time, and the reason was that there wasn't a strong enough field, is what they said to me. They re-advertised again. I applied, and at this time they were a bit more brutally honest and said to me that we don't think that you have the necessary experience to be able to take on one of these schools as the head teacher. You've only been in education for about 5 years, and now you want to run one of our flagship schools in Newham. So I thought that was the end of the story. But then my mentor, who had retired by then, just a year earlier, they employed him as a sixth form expert. And whilst they were advertising, he said, well, I think I know someone that would be really good for this job. And he recommended me. So I applied again.
Applied a third time.
I applied a third time for the job. And this time I was interviewed by about 6 heads and the local authority chief exec. And thankfully, they gave me the job on this occasion.
Yeah. I think there's a message there to all those involved in recruitment to be a bit more imaginative and drawing up the person's spec of a new role. I mean, in your case, the restriction of only shortlisting those who had already been head teachers had the effect of making their best candidate invisible. I think recruiters need to be a bit more imaginative. You've got the job, and it's a new school, so you've got to recruit all the staff and your first cohort of students. How do you go about that?
Well, the first thing to say is I wasn't recruited until January of the year that we were opening. And most schools, if they're starting new, would have at least a 1 year lead in time. Yeah. I had about 4 months to get everything in order for September. The building wasn't complete. I hadn't recruiting any members of staff yet and no students. So by the time I handed my notice, it wasn't until March that I started. And with teachers, if you want to recruit them for September, they have to resign by the 31st of May. So we had a lot of work to do to get the school up and running and persuade young people that they should come and join us, and parents as well, to put their futures in our hands, given we had no results, no building to really show because it was still a building site, no staff. So you can imagine it was quite a challenge in the early days. Yeah.
And you still had a teaching load while you were trying to do all this.
Yeah, so I was still expected to, I wanted to, but I was teaching in my secondary schools. I was still contracted to teach the classes there and prepare them for exams. So what I would do is I would teach my classes. I would then go and draft job descriptions and put adverts out in the Times Education Supplement to recruit, or do interviews over Skype, or do interviews, and then go back and teach my classes again. And if I missed that class, I would reschedule it for 5 o'clock so they wouldn't miss any of their learning, in order to prepare them for their exams. So I worked tirelessly, but anyone that set up anything from scratch would recognize that you have to put the hours in, and you need to have a formidable work ethic to be able to get these things off the ground and make them successful.
Yeah. Did you get all your staff in place by the time you opened that September?
Yeah, we managed to recruit all the staff we need in high quality caliber. And I think the vision of serving disadvantaged students and having that aspirations of doing things differently. And I wasn't shy, or I wasn't apologetic about what we wanted to do. And I was quite clear that this institution was going to send students to the best universities in the country, both in the UK and abroad. And I made that a clear statement. It wasn't as though I was hoping they would go to some of the best universities. It was It was my belief that they were going to go to the universities, and I think that resonated with people, and therefore they joined and were part of this fantastic adventure that we've all been on so far.
So it certainly resonated with the staff, but did it resonate with your first cohort of students? How did you go about selecting them?
So it was interesting because when I went around to schools to do assemblies, I would say in assemblies that I want students to go to Harvard, MIT, Princeton, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge. There's no reason why you can't be the Prime Minister of this country. And I would look across a sea of faces, and you would see people just look at me as though I was bonkers, and it was going to be impossible. And the worst thing was that you would see teachers standing in the flanks, and they would have a similar look on their face. And this was exactly the reason why I gave up the legal career to come in, was to challenge this almost soft bigotry of low expectations that exist, and almost to end this sort of the transmission of disadvantage from one generation to the next. And I think the students started to believe that this was possible. And I remember in the early days, the conversation in the corridors, there were some students discussing, well, should I go to Oxford or should I go to Harvard? As though it was something that was really easy to get to. But for me, just hearing them have that aspiration, I got the sense that, okay, we're getting somewhere. Once the students start speaking that language, then we're making change in the psychology of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Yeah. So you have your vision. What did you do during the first weeks when you first opened to try and realise that vision?
Well, we sent all the students. We take all the students to Cambridge University the first day. So now it's almost 300 students taken there. They have lectures by academics from Cambridge University. So again, we set the tone. This is somewhere where you should be aspiring to go. The admission to
that was on the very first day.
That's on the first day. Yes, we take them all. Yeah, and they have a tour of the colleges. So I think it really sets the scene about or gives the message of what we're all about. And then the second day, we have companies, high-profile companies, come in to work with students, again, talking about these are the type of professions that you can enter and access. And our responsibility and our job is to help you and support you do that. But it begins with you having the belief that you can do it.
Yeah. And I think those first few weeks, that's when I first came into contact with you, because I got an email out of the blue saying, please, will you come and present at our new school? So I looked you up on the internet and I saw that your mission was identical to ours at the Harvard Outreach, which is to encourage students from underrepresented groups to get into top universities. So I think that Harvard was the first university to give a presentation at NCS about 3 or 4 weeks after you opened. I've been back every year since, sometimes accompanied by other alumni. So how significant was that in your success at getting students into particularly US colleges?
I think it was extremely important, and being able to tap into your expertise and knowledge and know-how. I had an idea that I wanted to send students to the Ivies or some of the other high-profile American universities, but I didn't really know much about the US process or the application or any of that stuff. So being able to invite you in, Stuart, and to have your knowledge and expertise to guide us through the process and the students was invaluable. And I think I don't think we would have had the success that we've had so far if it wasn't for the Harvard Club of UK in supporting that vision and mission. And I know you've come in on several occasions to run mock interviews. You've done sessions with our students in supporting them through that. So that's been an extremely important part of the equation.
Yeah, well, that's certainly good to hear. But during the first year or so, there must have been some significant challenges as well. What were your main challenges during that first year when you were getting set up?
Well, the first challenge was in the first couple of weeks, I had the director of children's services knocking on my door, informing me that the school was illegal, and the irony is not lost on a former banking and finance solicitor being head teacher of a school that hasn't been set up properly by the local authority. So that was an interesting period.
Yes, yes, we've got in fact, we've got a slide here. This is from the local paper. It's December 2014. So this happened when you'd only been open 3 months.
Yeah, not that long, to be honest. And it was had a chair of governors and, as I said, the director of children's services. That goes in the press. All the hard work to recruit new students and staff. We were seriously concerned that they might leave us, but thankfully the staff believed strongly in the vision of the NCS, and the students stayed. And thankfully that didn't have a detrimental impact on the long-term success of the school.
That's good. Excellent. Now I'm guessing that your first cohort of students, when you first opened, were fairly kind of straightforward to recruit. But I know that more recently you've had a vast number of students, all chasing quite a limited number of places. So how do you go about selecting which students to take each year?
So the NCS is an academic selective sixth form, but when you get to sixth forms, they're all selective. Everyone has an admission criteria. Our admission criteria has increased over the years, and partly because of the caliber of students who've applied to us because of the success at the NCS. So selection process is based on GCSE scores in secondary school, and also a personal statement.
Yeah, and and what do you think are the ingredients of your success? Say I'm a new principal and I want to start sixth form that sends loads of students to top universities. What can other educators learn from your example?
I think there are several ingredients to running outstanding schools, and I think this is across the board. I don't think it's just at sixth forms. I think it's at state comprehensives anywhere. I think number one, you need to have sky high expectations, and I think there is a difference between sort of saying it and actually believing your young people can do it. So I think that's number one.
Yeah.
I think you need to have an extremely strong recruitment program for teachers and training as well, and retention. That's important. We've managed to recruit some really strong teachers and train them and retain them. I think that's important. I think the other thing which people talk about but not necessarily implement is a no excuse culture. I think what happens when you work in areas which serve disadvantaged communities is very easy to fall into the trap of trying to have high expectations, but then make excuses for the young people because of the background that they come from. I think one of the things...
Sorry to interrupt. Do all your students come from East London?
No, the students, in terms of where they're traveling from, has become more geographically varied, but still from disadvantaged backgrounds, so Tower Hamlets, Newham, Redbridge. So yes, the predominant students do come from Newham, but we get an increasing number from outside Newham as well. So I think the no excuse culture is important. Lots of schools talk about it, but when I go in and visit, you don't see that in the actual delivery of the school curriculum or the delivery of the standards and the expectations of the students. So I think that's quite important, and there needs to be a focus on immaculate behavior, and ensuring that students, the standards that you have are extremely high for them. And again, this links to the no excuses culture that I talked about. And then it's about leadership. I think you need to have strong leadership across the board, starting from the head teacher of the school, but also your senior leadership and leaders of the subjects, and a relentless focus on learning and teaching, and a forensic analysis of data, and ensuring that no student gets left behind.
Right. The immaculate behaviour bit, how do you try to instill that in your students? Or do they tend to have it already when they arrive?
No, I think it's a myth that students will have it. I think they will behave in accordance with what you allow them to. Ultimately, they're still young people, So it starts from as basic as having a school uniform. That is very important. Professional, smart dress. We start with that. There is no tolerance, or there's zero tolerance of poor behavior within lessons, especially if it impacts anyone's learning. And I think there is that part of it, but there's also getting students to believe strongly in why they've come to the NCS. And as long as if you can tie the two together and inspire them and ensure that they are aspirational for themselves, the twin effect means that you don't have the behavioral issues that most state comprehensives will have.
I think what I've been particularly impressed with when I visited NCS is the self-discipline of the students. I think the sort of discipline that's held in place by the threat of external sanction is much weaker. I think your sort of discipline, I characterize it as self-discipline, which is much stronger because it comes from within. Now, I don't know how you go about instilling self-discipline as opposed to the other sort, because I certainly don't see you stalking the corridors with a big stick or shouting your mouth off or anything. How do you encourage self-discipline in your students?
Well, I think Stuart, like I said, I think it's a twin approach. I don't think it's an either or. I think with the self-discipline comes this idea of having extremely high expectations and understanding that they too can go to some of these universities. And I think what's happened over the years is when you've got people from students from similar backgrounds going to Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, MIT, it becomes almost, well, if they can do it, why can't I? This school has supported other students, so they can support me. And then the language of aspiration is automatically fed through into that. And then you get a culture of scholarship. So I think you're right. There is internal, intrinsic motivation to succeed, but it's hard to sometimes even sort of visualize it. But the environment and the culture that's been created is also a driver for students to behave and succeed and have strong behavior for learning.
Yeah. And what about your teaching methods? I remember one of the articles I read about NCS talked about traditional teaching methods. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's more of a fusion between the traditional and the modern?
So I'm quite clear on the traditional model for teaching. I think when I trained, I think, and the way I was taught was this idea of a child-centered approach to learning. And it's almost organic that, you know, if you ask the right questions, young people are going to be able to come up with these answers and solve all of these issues. And I think what you find is that you end up having lessons that just don't go anywhere, are low level, and are quite superficial. And I see this a lot when I go to schools. There's almost a disdain for a teacher who is knowledgeable and expert and has an expertise in it, actually delivering lessons to students. And that's because we've got into a culture where, oh no, young people can't sit and listen for 20 minutes or half an hour, and we need to make it fun and engaging. Learning is fun and engaging. The subject itself that you are talking about is fun and engaging. And I think we do a disservice to education and to teachers by trying to make something which is interesting intrinsically by itself into engaging, fun kind of activities that do not really prepare students for strong academic scholarship and discussion.
Yeah, that's interesting. So final question before we go on to questions from the participants. Where do you go from here? I mean, you've been open since 2014, about 6 years. What's down the road? What's where do you want to go in the next 5 or 6 years?
So I think for me, being able to support students with less privileged backgrounds is not a 2-year program. I think what you will find is that if we get them the A-levels, they go to university, and what can't happen with sixth form provision and what's happened in the past, and it's part of the model, is we say, we've done our job, off you go, good luck. If we're serious about taking students from less privileged backgrounds and making sure that they go to the best universities and then work their way up so they're at the decision-making tables at some of the most high-profile companies, that's going to require a longer-term investment from schools and the young people that we serve. And I think there's no safer place for them than schools where they can talk about imposter syndrome, for example. I would have loved to be able to gone back to my old school, and the school being able, and being free to say that to my teachers, look, this is where I am because I trust them and I feel safe in their company. And they would be able to say, well, that's absolutely fine in how you're feeling. Let's get somebody else who's from a similar background to you to help and support and talk to you about this, so that you can overcome that and discuss the next step. So I think for us, it's about keeping in contact with our young people, having programs in place for them all the way through at different stages in their career. And I think that's the kind of model we need schools to adopt if we're serious about taking young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who are bright and able and getting them to the decision-making tables of some of these big companies.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely fascinating, Mohsin. Thanks very much for that. We've got plenty of questions coming in, so I'm going to sign off now and hand back to Vicky. Vicky.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I just turned on my video, so hopefully you can see me. Yeah, that was very inspiring and very informative indeed. We do have a lot of questions. I'll start off. The first person to ask was Wen Tao Xiong. There are two questions. Based on your experience, how important are role models? She heard from friends in China who work in disadvantaged schools that because there are very few of the students who have gone on to four-year colleges, students who enter the school do not really want to make the effort to study because there's no role model in older students going off to the colleges. And also in a semi-related question, the question is, a very high percentage of the students manage to go on to elite universities, but some of them don't. What options do you have for such students? Vocational schools, again, drawing on his or her experience from Beijing. There are lots of vocational schools. Some are good and some are bad, but the students themselves may not be able to make the distinction easily. So they're looking to a place like NCS for guidance.
Yeah, two really good questions. So in terms of role models, I think they're extremely important. I think one of the things that I wanted to do straight away was to send at least one student quickly to an Ivy League university, because I recognized that if I could point to one student from the area that we grew up in, or I grew up in, and say, look, she went there, Tasfia Shikdar, in 2017, now you have no reason. So you're absolutely spot on in terms of role models for students. But I think sometimes we're always looking for role models outside of our schools. And I think there are role models within schools. Our teachers are role models. And I think we need to play that up. They are highly experienced experts in their subject, and they need to be given the platform to be able to be the role models for our young people as well. So I definitely think it's important to do that. But my worry about role models is that, again, in what I see in areas of disadvantaged or less privileged backgrounds, is we're trying to find role models who might be rap artists, for example, because there might be a greater connection with their backgrounds, because we somehow think that they are that the kids can sort of relate to them, and I worry about that narrative again. So I'm very clear about who our role models are and who I want our students to, who the role models should be for our students, and I don't sort of dilute that just because our students come from less privileged backgrounds. The other question around what happens to students who don't go to elite universities. Well, they'll go to other tier universities within the UK, but there is an increasing and growing number of students who are taking up degree apprenticeships, and that's becoming a very popular course or an avenue for them. And I think rightly so, because why pay £9,500 a year when you can get a high-profile company who's offering a degree apprenticeship to pay for it for you and train you at the same time. So we're also pushing that avenue for some of our students.
Yes, brilliant. Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer. Now, this question is from Pasha, who asks, you spoke about survival and the challenges of being seen as a SWAT. Can you talk about that in relation to NCS's academic environment? How do you do things differently there so that students do not have this, they don't have the same concern that you did when you were growing up?
Yeah, well, I think it's completely different. The culture is completely different. We talk about unleashing the geek in you. And I think you're proud to be a geek. You know, that's not seen as a negative slur at the NCS. Being scholarly, being academic is not an issue at the NCS. So I think we're constantly talking up the importance of education and the value of education, and why it's important for students to be educated and not be ashamed of it. So I think again it goes back to leadership, and as head teacher I model that, and my staff model that, and therefore that feeds through into the young people. And the expectation is hard to swim against the tide when the vast majority of people actually value education and think it's important to get one.
Yeah, I guess peer pressure works very differently, manifests itself in a very different way under your leadership. Yeah. Here's a question from Peter Fleming. Congratulations, the culture you've achieved sounds impressive. And of course, you're selecting the very best and most ambitious students from disadvantaged groups. There's much talk currently about the underachievement of Black youngsters and white working class youngsters. Do you think you could achieve the same no excuses culture in a less selective sixth form?
Good question. I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know. But I'm confident. I'm confident that I think young people want to succeed. I don't think you'll ask a young person, okay, what do you want to do with your life? And if I paint you a picture where you're struggling to pay your mortgage or you don't have a job and the rest of it, they'll say, well, I'm happy with that. I just can't imagine young people happy with that kind of future. So I think I come from a position where if there is an institution and you have adults who actually believe that it's possible, I agree the challenges are more difficult, and it might take a bit of a longer time because we started up from nothing. So it's easier to implement the culture and the philosophies that way. But if you're taking over a school where there are issues, it'll take longer. But I'm convinced that it would work. And there are schools like that. So you take, for example, a school that's been in the press quite a lot, Michaela School in Wembley. They adopt a similar approach about a no excuse culture, high aspirations, and their results are sky high. There are Mossbourne Academy in Hackney, similar thing. So I think there are examples of schools who have adopted similar approaches that have seen success in schools where you have a more comprehensive intake. So I think it's more challenging, more difficult, may take longer, but it's not insurmountable.
Right. Yeah. I think it's all about, going in the right direction and, just being upwardly mobile. Great. So we have a question from Yuka Thomas, and I have a little bit to add to that as well. So basically the question is, what emphasis do you place on pastoral care in conjunction to academics and also extracurriculars? And just to, shed a bit of color, American colleges tend to like well-rounded people, whereas British universities, they ask you to choose a specialization upon application. So how do you juggle the different, kind of students that British and American universities are looking for?
Yeah, so in terms of the first question about pastoral care, the sixth form is still run as a school. So you have heads of year with pastoral responsibility. You also have a senior member of the SLT who has pastoral responsibility as well. There are tutor times. There are sessions which take place as part of CPSHE to support students throughout their time in sixth form. So all of that is pretty standard in most schools. The issue that's, I think, it's more unique to NCS because of its high academic performance is students themselves feeling as though they've come from a very being very successful in their secondary school, now come to a high performing academic sixth form where they may have been top in their class. Now they may be average, or they may feel that they're average. And our job is to make them realize that it's not a competition against your peers. It's your own journey, and it's about making sure that you're successful and you take from the school what you need to get to where you want to. So mental health does continue to be an issue, but I think this is prevalent, not just at the NCS, but across schools across the country. And whilst it may be easy to say it's because of the high aspirations academic content, I would argue that it's more to do with the change in social media platforms that now exist that previously didn't. And there's, we're battling with that aspect and supporting parents about how to wean their children off social media and the implications of that. So strong pastoral care across the board. In terms of extracurricular, there are strong academic extracurricular, super curriculum, Oxbridge supervisions, Ivy League provisions, but there's also sports that's available. So we started off with fencing, horse riding, sports across the board, but we also make sure that students who are interested in applying to America are given the support to get the extracurricular support that they need, because we understand that that's quite an important part in applying to an American university.
Great, yes, thank you. So your counselors would support students applying to both, or would they prefer that they pick either British or American universities?
They apply to both. So any student that's interested in applying to an American university would apply to both the UK universities, including Oxbridge, and at the same time they'll be making an application through the Common App or through their own individual applications if a university requires that.
Great, thank you. From Charlotte, what do you look for in the personal statements when students apply to your school? You had talked about the school being highly academic, and yeah, do you also consider personal statements? Is it when you look at students to admit? Is it do you look at the holistic picture?
So we do look at that, but the reality is it's an academic sixth form, so the priority is on the academic part. And in personal statements, we tend to look for whether the student has a deep interest in a particular subject and whether they've gone above and beyond, read around it. So has something been introduced to them by their teacher, and they've taken the initiative and gone further and investigated and researched. So I think it's pretty similar to what most universities will be looking for in their undergraduate applications, a real passion for their subjects and interest in their courses, and evidence of additional research. So it's the same thing for us.
Wonderful. Right, from Rodrigo, if a student cannot go to NCS because of distance, as an example, do you have a secret, is it a secret source for them to make it to the Ivy League or Russell Group universities while studying at other comprehensive schools?
My view is I think it's almost impossible if you go to a school that doesn't have an Ivy League program in place to support students. Newham has never had a single student go to the Ivy League, and I can't believe for 1 second that there hasn't been talented individuals that have existed in the borough pre-2014 who would have had a chance to go in. You know, how can it be that NCS sets up in 2014 and by 2017 you've now got students getting into Ivy Leagues on full we call them scholarships, but it's their full fees paid for, really. So I think it's incredibly difficult, and I think partly because they don't know about it, and secondly, you don't have teachers to be able to support them through the process. You know, we have a dedicated team that I've recruited to support with the whole Oxbridge and the Ivy League program. And that's interesting. That's what private schools do. Private schools have teams because they have a critical mass of students who are going to be applying. Most schools might have one, if any, applying. So therefore, schools don't see the need to do it.
Great. And this question from Julian is related to that. So is a percentage of your students who go to top universities higher than the corresponding percentage among the entire student population with the scores that qualify them for your school? So I suppose you know what he means is that so if you just look at the potential and the abilities of the student population in general. I mean, to what extent does NCS give their own students a leg up? He follows up with, I'm sure you have many measures of success, but I'm curious about this one. And I wondered to what extent you find it relevant, and also what your approach might do for students who are not already doing well in the meritocracy. Okay,
so I think what he's getting at is this idea of a progress score, which I think is important. I think for me, progress is probably more important than the actual raw academic attainment. And you're right that we take able students, so we should have strong attainment on pure numbers. But the good thing about the NCS is the NCS progress score, according to an external measure called ALPS, grades us as 1, which means that we're in the top 1% of value added for students. So in simple terms, that means if an NCS student comes to us with their GCSE grades, on average, they will get higher grades. In fact, it's over half a A-level grade higher than students nationally who have the same GCSE grades on entry. So it's comparing like for like, and saying that over half a grade we're adding to them compared to somewhere else. Now, if you look at most independent schools, that tends to be 0 or even minus sometimes. So NCS is again one of the top schools in terms of progress measure when it comes to looking at data. In terms of the second question, you can't get these results unless you have a really strong intervention program, which means that you need to identify students quickly who might be underachieving, and then be able to put in support mechanisms both in class and outside to do that. And that's something that we do relentlessly and forensically, because we look at data carefully to see if we can find trends, and we have found trends when you look at a student's average GCSE grade, performance in certain cross-year assessments, and you can identify that student is going to be struggling if without intervention. And that's how we support students going forward.
Great. From Dio, congratulations on your achievements. Apart from the educational attainment, do you prepare them also to have a great experience socially in the American universities where where campus life plays such a big part in your education?
I think the honest answer is probably no. We focus relentlessly on the academics, and focus on getting them to these universities and giving them the skills to do that. The problem we have is that you have less than 2 years to get students who've come with strong GCSE grades, but to get them to a level where they can compete with some of the best schools the best students from the independent and grammar schools. That is the challenge we have. So I don't try to pretend that we can be all things to all people. We are an academic sixth form that is delivering on those results and getting those students to do that. If we had more time, if it was a 11 to 18 or 19 school, I think we would have more opportunities to develop all those things. But I think resources are scarce, time is scarce. We need to be relentless and focus on one particular thing that we can deliver well.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yes. Anushka wants to know how your teachers overcome possible prejudice against students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because in her experience, most teachers in the general population do have prejudices against students from more difficult backgrounds. So what sort of recruitment process do you have in place for the teachers and training, and also what role do the teachers play in the transformation of students? How do you make the teachers believe in the students?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in all of our recruitment material, the vision of the school is writ large. If you're applying to the NCS, you know exactly what we're about. If you don't believe that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds can get into the elite professions, and you don't want to help them do that, then the NCS is the wrong school for you to apply to. But even through the interviews, the classic questions about what's your motivation to teach, what is your philosophy on teaching, what do you think about young people who might be underachieving. You're looking out for, if you're looking for people who put a ceiling on a student's achievement. So for example, if they're struggling, then talent is fixed, and therefore, or ability is fixed, and therefore I don't think they can achieve that, then they're not the right fit for our school. So the language of the school, the culture of the school is aspirational. I think we sometimes, it's not so much the students, we also have to realign our aspirations. I was, when I started, I thought if I can get 1 or 2 kids into the Ivies, was in the NCS, I've done my job. It's hard enough to get 1 in, but we've got 5 and 8 offers into the Ivy Leagues. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe I set my aspirations too low. Why not 10 or 15? Why can't 50 kids go to Oxbridge? So I think we're constantly realigning our own ambitions and aspirations for the students, because if you set the bar high enough, these young people, what I've noticed, jump over it every time, and then you have to realign it again. So I think we should always have the highest aspirations for our young people. They can do it. We just need to have adults who believe in them.
Yeah, that's the best type of moving targets. Yeah. Another question about teachers. How do you keep the commitment of the best teachers and manage the exit of the worst ones?
Well, I think if I deal with the second one about the exit of the worst ones, I hope we have a strong recruitment selection process that we don't get to that stage. And to be honest, since we started in 2014, we've had a really good retention rate of members of staff who've stayed with the NCS, because as I said, the actual, the vision of the NCS, the moral imperative, the actual need and requirement for it does attract teachers who want to actually make a difference. And then the training of staff is important. As I said, we moved away from this child-centered approach to teaching, to going back to traditional teaching methods, and you've seen the impact of that in terms of the results. But I think with teaching, the great thing is that you have that moral imperative. You can always pull on the strings of teachers and adults when you say, look, you are not just teaching your subject, but you are shaping the future of this young person. And if you don't do your job well, then you're not going to, these young people are going to suffer. And for me, the acid test is very clear. Would I send my child to this school? Very simple. That is the question I ask every single teacher. Would you be happy with the lesson that you've delivered if it was your own child sitting there? And if they say yes, then it's good enough for me. But there's always areas and room for improvement for all of us.
Sounds like you have a very robust recruitment process indeed for teachers and students alike. Do you have an issue with turnover among staff members?
No, I think we've been very lucky. As I said, lots of the teachers have started with us in 2014. So we had this rich tapestry of history together that I constantly remind them of the battles we've gone through. Stuart alluded to one of them in terms of the illegal school. We also had issues around finances, buildings, etc., etc. The list is endless. But I think the camaraderie that a team has when they're setting up something new, it's quite special. You don't get that many opportunities to do something like this. So lots of the teachers have stayed on and believe strongly in the vision of the NCS and want to support it moving forward.
Yeah, I suppose they consider themselves stakeholders. They have skin in the game, yes. So moving away from teachers to parents, this is a question from Peter. You mentioned, you talked about, the importance for you of the aspirations of your own parents. Now, not all of the youngsters who come to your school have supportive parents or carers. Do you think it's possible for an institution to overcome parental apathy or even hostility towards education?
Yeah, I think we've got to a position now where I've removed parents from the equation in terms of what we want how we want to inspire the young person. My view is that the school has to become the surrogate parent. They spend lots of time with us at the NCS, and therefore we have an obligation and responsibility to imbue that aspirations for them. So if you have parents, and it's different at the NCS. So for example, you might have conservative families who, typically girls, parents of girls who could go to an Ivy League university, could go to Oxbridge, but no, they need to stay at home. So the battle that I have with the parents is that challenging their own cultural conservative nature about their own daughters or their own children, and trying to break that. So we've had success in doing that. And again, I'm unapologetic about that. I'm quite honest, candid, frank with them about the talents of their daughters in particular, especially in the area that we're in. And if they don't support their daughters, then they're doing them a disservice and they're not fulfilling their potential. And I think on the whole, that seems to have gotten through. And I think it helps that you have a head teacher who comes from the same community as them. There is that connection between me and the parents and the young people. So I think that breaks certain potential relationship barriers that may exist.
Yeah. Or do you have to deal with a lot of instances like that? Because I would assume that, by, the very act of applying to a school like NCS would mean that the family value education.
They do, but you have fantastic universities on your doorstep in London. So the challenge is, well, why should my daughter or even my son go to Oxford or Cambridge, or go to Warwick, or go to an Ivy League university when they can go to Imperial, UCL, LSE, which is in London? So they have strong arguments about that. But my view is, if your daughter or son can get into Oxbridge, then that's where they should be going. And if they get into Harvard or MIT or Stanford or Princeton or any of the other Ivies, that's where they should be going. So yeah, I think quite relentless in trying to persuade them to do that.
Very good. Yes. So we are 2 minutes to 7. Would you mind staying on for an extra 5 to 10 minutes? There are a couple of questions to go through.
Absolutely fine.
Right.
Yes.
And also, I see a couple of hands raised. If you have questions, if you could use the chat feature, that would be very helpful indeed. So rather than having to call on members of the audience to speak and turn on the video, it would be much better if we could have everything in writing via the chat function. Thank you. Right. A question that actually you talked about pastoral care, but this is a question about the potential downside of high expectations / competition. Have you had many issues related to anxiety in high performers, and how do you manage a balance between a high performance culture and performance anxiety?
Yep, I think that's a valid question, and one that we've experienced, and I'm sure other institutions that are high performing institutions, both in the corporate world but also at university, have also experienced. Like I said, I think we have a really strong pastoral program. I think we have a counselor, we have an NCS coach, a dedicated NCS coach who supports both students and staff. But I think also it's the daily conversations and the relationships that we have with our young people, and reminding them that it's not a competition. It's about their own journey, and as long as they are better today than they were yesterday, and they adopt a strong work ethic, the results will take care of themselves. I also talk about in lots of assemblies about performance under pressure, because our young people are under pressure. They're under pressure to perform. And rather than trying to brush it under the carpet and say it doesn't exist, we face that head on and explain to them, yes, you are in a high performing institution. You are going to go to another high performing institution. So how are you going to manage and cope with that? And therefore supporting students and helping support students through that process is important. However, inevitably, I think there are some young people who need additional support, which we can't provide them. And this is something that has existed not just at the NCS, but when you look at their backgrounds and their history, it's something that's existed throughout their schooling. And that's something that whilst we can support with, we are not professionals or experts in that particular area, which means that we would refer that on to the experts to support with.
Thank you. I'd like to sneak in one of my questions. Now, how do you deal with situations where a student gets a place at a dream school, but the school does not offer financial aid? You see, in the US, only 5 colleges have need blind admissions, and some of them, while they offer financial aid, they actually take that into account before making the admissions decision. In the UK, I gather that it's more difficult to get financial subsidies. So how do you deal with?
So in terms of the US, the schools only apply to the universities that give full financial aid, are needs blind. That's otherwise they just can't afford it. There's the second part of it, the attraction of the Ivy Leagues, and how I was able to manage to persuade them, is precisely this reason, is that most of our young people, families' incomes is way below the income where they would be expected to pay any fees at these universities. So I envisaged, well, if I can get them in, well, given their family's income, the university has to pay for it. And what you've seen is that in all of the 8 offers that the students have got over the last 4 years, they've received either full or nearly full. So, I think one of them had to pay maybe £2,500 a year, which is nothing, either compared to the UK university or even the American system. So that was one of the reasons why I pushed quite hard, not just because of the kudos and the status of the Ivies, but also it was quite easy to persuade students that you'll get free education if you manage to get in.
Great, that's good to know. Right, a couple of people are asking questions that would require your giving your own personal opinion. For example, Kendra and Dina asked if you think there is an advantage to studying at an Ivy League school as opposed to a Russell Group university.
So my personal view is, I think if a UK student can get into an Ivy League, then I think that shows a greater level of competition to get in, because from my understanding, there's roughly about 120 places for international students, at some of the Ivy Leagues, given that it's going to be equal, that's a 50-50 split, you're competing for around 60 places as an international student. So I think having one of those universities on your CV, just by virtue of the fact that it is an Ivy, is strong enough. But the fact that you're an international student who's made it there, I think gives you a significant advantage. But again, as you said, it's my own personal opinion on that.
Yeah, but that's valid. Right. Okay. Yes, Eugene is asking about how to get his young children into Oxford or Harvard. What advice would you give him? What are the key few things that you would suggest that the parents focus on now and going forward?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I think the first thing to say is that getting into the top universities requires strong academic ability. And the best thing you can do for your child is to be having, those rigorous academic conversations, depending, age dependent, allowing them to think flexibly, to problem solve, to have a strong work ethic, ensuring that at school they're constantly being pushed and challenged. I think that's the first thing to do. I don't think there is this massive secret about that. I think it's just being a good thinker and being exposed to lots of material early on, which is one of the problems that I think state schools don't do enough of. It's very much lots of rote learning, repetition, regurgitating, passing exams. And if I was in charge of a state school, I would do that education very different. Yes, lots of knowledge and understanding, but also lots of things around thinking, flexibly, evaluating, analysis, rather than just regurgitating, because that's not going to help them later on in trying to apply for these universities. Then I think once they've got that level of flexibility of thought, then this is where the school needs to really come in and show that its expertise. And that's where, personal statement preparation, an understanding of what they're looking for, choosing the right courses, that's really important. Especially Oxford and Cambridge, you choose the wrong course, the competition becomes significantly harder, and then lots of interview preparation. So we do all of that stuff to support the students going forward.
Great. Yes, I understand that's a subjective question, and I'm sorry about putting you on the spot. Here is what, yeah, but I thought it might be fun to ask. I mean, it's not so much beyond the scope of this talk. Right. Marcus wants to know how your successful work could be systematically replicated elsewhere. For example, other schools across the country, what is needed? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I touched on it with Stuart when he asked, what do you think of the ingredients of a successful school? If I had to pick one, I think it would be the leadership of the head teacher and the no excuses culture. I think it starts with that. As soon as you can get rid of behavioural issues and instill aspiration amongst the students, a lot of the other things start becoming a lot easier. When teachers can't teach because you have low-level disruption in lessons, even your very able students in your class are not going to be able to succeed. And I think where you have schools in disadvantaged backgrounds, the behaviour when you speak to teachers seems to be the biggest impediment to actually delivering strong, high-quality educational provision. Able students tend to succeed in spite of the school rather than because of the school, and that's the problem.
Great. Thank you. So I think we have time for probably 2 more questions from Cheryl. Where do your Ivy League students go after graduation? Do they stay in the US or come back to the UK? And yeah, she asked another question. Let's take this one first. Thank you.
So in terms of graduating, the first student to graduate will be this academic year. So we haven't had anyone graduating yet. So I can't answer that question in terms of where they're going to go, but I assume they're probably going to come back to the UK, and that would be Tassia Shikdar. But I don't know yet because none have graduated.
Fair enough. Yes, I didn't think about that. Yes, exactly. Great. So I'm just scrolling through the questions, if you could bear with me. Right, the last one is also from Cheryl, regarding picking courses, do you mean to apply to a course of study at Oxford that is less competitive in terms of admissions?
Yes, so this is another perennial issue that students from less privileged backgrounds have, which I don't think is seen in schools which serve a more affluent family. You tend to find that students from less privileged backgrounds want to apply for courses that give a clear route into a profession. So they'll apply for law, medicine, dentistry, those kind of courses, which, as we know, are the most competitive. And I think one of the things, one of the reasons they do that is because the parents want clarity as to what job they're going to get at the end of the process, rather than having a realization that the university that you go to and the course that you study is, the university you go to is probably more important than the course that you actually study, assuming you have a passion for, for the course that you're doing. So a lot of our work has been trying to persuade students that there are things other than medicine, law, and dentistry. Even though we have, this year 55 students have gone to study medicine, to look at alternative courses. So we've done a lot of work around alternative course provision and persuading students and their parents that if you can get into Oxbridge and do English literature because your student loves English literature, rather than trying to get them to do law because you want them to become a lawyer, that's going to serve them better because they've got Oxford or Cambridge on their CV. And if they then want to go and do law, great, they can go and do that. But it's the university name that's going to make the difference in terms of future career prospects.
I really appreciate that. I mean, that's a lot of variables to deal with in advising, these young people, channeling them to the right schools, the right country, the right courses. It's not, it's definitely a huge challenge. And I guess what you said about choosing courses, that would definitely be more pertinent for British universities than for American liberal arts colleges. Yeah. So I'm afraid I do have to wrap this up. Mohsin, if we have additional questions, do you mind if we send them to you? And maybe if you wish to put your answers in writing or maybe communicate directly with the person who asked a question, would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely, I'm more than happy to do that. If people are taking the time to give up their evening to attend this, the least I can do is answer their questions and respond.
So thank you very much for a most inspiring conversation to Mohsin and Stuart, who really organized this and put this together. Thank you all of you who joined and for the thought-provoking questions. We have audience members from different countries. I don't know if you know that. It just goes to show that your success story, the story of NCS and Mohsin, is a very universally inspiring one. We've recorded the event and we'll make that available to all the participants. We'll share a link. Haven't figured out how to do that yet. It could be on our website, it could be on Facebook, but we'll make sure that anybody who signed on, who is a participant now, will get a link. So thank you again, and the Harvard Club of the UK look forward to welcoming you to the next event.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.